They thought he was just another black man they could push around. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The Texas night was stifling, the air thick with humidity as William Hovind drove down a dark, deserted road just outside Houston. His car, sleek but unassuming, hummed softly as it glided through the dimly lit stretch. The only light came from the faint glow of his dashboard and the occasional flicker of neon signs in the distance. It had been a long day at work, and William, a seasoned federal prosecutor and the United States Attorney General, was looking forward to finally getting home. But as the faint glow of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, a sigh escaped his lips. He slowed his car and pulled over to the side of the road, his trained eye noticing how quickly the patrol car followed. His hands gripped the steering wheel firmly at the 10 and 2 positions, his body language calm but cautious. The patrol car's sirens blared for a moment longer before falling silent. 2 officers, their silhouettes framed by the harsh glare of their headlights, stepped out. Officer Dale Thompson, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted his belt as he approached the driver's side window with deliberate slowness. Behind him, Officer Curtis Brown stood with his hand hovering near his holstered weapon, his eyes scanning the car like a predator sizing up its prey. William rolled down the window, his expression neutral. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice measured and even. Thompson leaned down, his face illuminated by the dim interior light of the car. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Of course," William replied, reaching slowly toward the glove compartment. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Thompson's lips curled into a smirk. "Your rear taillight's out. That's a problem." William paused for a split second. He knew the claim was false. His car had been serviced just last week, but he said nothing. Instead, he handed over his license and registration, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. Brown circled around to the passenger side, his flashlight scanning the interior. "You been drinking tonight?" he asked brusquely. "No, officer," William said, his tone calm but firm. "I just finished work and was driving home." Thompson straightened, his hand resting on the top of the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. William hesitated, not out of fear but out of strategic calculation. He could see the predatory gleam in their eyes, the way their body language screamed of power unchecked. He had seen this play out countless times in court, innocent men and women caught in a system designed to grind them down. But he also knew the importance of playing his role, of not revealing his hand too soon. "Is that really necessary?" William asked evenly. Thompson's smirk widened. "Did I stutter?" "Step out of the vehicle." William exhaled slowly and opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel shoulder. The night was eerily quiet, the distant chirping of crickets the only sound apart from the rumble of the patrol car's engine. Brown moved in close, gripping William's arm with unnecessary force as he turned him toward the car. "Hands on the hood," he commanded. William complied, his palms resting flat against the cool metal. The officers patted him down roughly, their movements deliberate and demeaning. Thompson leaned in close, his breath hot against William's ear. "Got something to hide?" he sneered. "No, officer," William replied, his voice steady despite the insult. "You're free to search the vehicle." They didn't find anything, of course. But that didn't stop Thompson from snapping the cuffs onto William's wrists with a loud click. "You're resisting?" Thompson declared loudly, his voice carrying into the empty night as though performing for an invisible audience. William turned his head slightly, his expression still calm. "I don't believe I've resisted at all, officer." "Let's see what a judge has to say about that," Brown said with a chuckle as he tightened the cuffs further. William didn't respond. He allowed himself to be led to the back of the patrol car, his mind already calculating his next moves. He knew how the system worked. He had spent years prosecuting cases and watching as the machinery of justice ground people like him into dust. But he also knew the power of patience. There was a time to fight and a time to observe, and for now he would let them think they had one. The courtroom was stark and imposing, its walls lined with dark wood paneling and faded brass fixtures. Judge Arthur Lane presided over the bench, his expression a mixture of boredom and barely concealed disdain. Known for his bias and curt rulings, Lane was exactly the kind of man William expected to encounter. The officers, Thompson and Brown, sat confidently at their table, their lawyer smirking as he shuffled through his notes. On the opposing side, William sat alone, his simple gray suit a stark contrast to the polished arrogance of his opponents. He listened intently as the charges were read. Resisting arrest, obstructing justice, and disorderly conduct. The officer's claims were as predictable as they were false. He was uncooperative from the start, Thompson testified, his voice dripping with feigned authority. We had no choice but to detain him. Is that so? Judge Lane drawled, his tone disinterested. Well, this seems straightforward. Mr. Hovind, do you have anything to say in your defense? William rose slowly, his movements deliberate. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, as he adjusted his tie and addressed the court. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but firm. I do have something to say. However, I would like to request permission to present evidence before I proceed. Lane raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed but curious. Evidence? What kind of evidence? William's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. The kind that might shed light on the true nature of this encounter. The gallery murmured softly, a ripple of intrigue spreading through the room. William returned to his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He had played his role perfectly, and now it was time to reveal the hand he had so carefully kept hidden. Judge Arthur Lane reclined slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the bench. His disinterest was palpable, the lines of his face hardened by years of presiding over cases he had long since stopped caring about. The officers, Thompson and Brown, sat at their table with casual arrogance, their confidence unshaken. They were used to this, the system had protected them time and time again. To them, this was just another routine. Proceed with your evidence, Lane said curtly, gesturing toward William. William stood, his movements deliberate and calm. The room was quiet, the air tense with anticipation. Every eye in the gallery was on him, some filled with curiosity, others with doubt. He retrieved a small USB drive from his pocket and handed it to the clerk. This drive, William began, his voice steady, contains footage from the body cameras of officers Thompson and Brown. I obtained this evidence through legal channels, and it will provide the court with an accurate account of the events that transpired during my traffic stop. The gallery buzzed with whispers, a ripple of intrigue spreading through the room. Lane raised a hand to silence them, his expression skeptical as he addressed William. Body camera footage? You must have connections, Mr. Hovind, to get something like that on such short notice. William's lips curved into a faint smile. You could say that, Your Honor. Lane sighed, gesturing for the clerk to load the footage onto the courtroom's monitor. Let's see what this is about, then. The screen flickered to life, and the room fell into silence. The footage began with the officers exiting their vehicle, their body cameras capturing the scene in stark clarity. The dark road, the flashing lights, the cautious but composed demeanor of William as he greeted them. It was all laid bare. License and registration, Thompson barked, his tone sharp and unnecessarily aggressive. The jury watched as William complied calmly, asking why he had been pulled over. The response was the fabricated claim of a broken taillight. As the footage continued, the courtroom saw the rough treatment William endured. The officers' voices, loud and commanding, painted a picture of authority used as a weapon. But William's composure never faltered. Even as they cuffed him and declared, "You're resisting," the footage revealed his compliance, his hands steady and his voice calm. Lane's expression darkened as the video played, his earlier dismissiveness replaced with something closer to unease. He leaned forward slightly, studying the screen with a furrowed brow. The officers, meanwhile, fidgeted in their seats, their earlier confidence beginning to waver. When the footage ended, the courtroom was silent. The weight of what they had just seen hung heavily in the air. Lane cleared his throat, His voice strained as he addressed the officers. "Care to explain this, gentlemen?" Thompson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Brown shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Their lawyer stood, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, body camera footage can be misleading. It doesn't capture the full context of the situation." William cut in smoothly, his voice calm but authoritative. "If I may, Your Honor, I have additional evidence to present." Lane waved him on, his curiosity now piqued. "Go ahead." William retrieved another document from his briefcase and handed it to the clerk. "These," he said, "are internal complaints filed against Officers Thompson and Brown. Over the past 5 years, there have been numerous allegations of misconduct, including excessive force and racial profiling. These documents were obtained through a legal records request." The gallery erupted into murmurs once again, the tension in the room reaching a fever pitch. Lane scanned the documents, his face growing darker with every page he turned. Thompson and Brown exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado now replaced with visible unease. "And there's more," William continued, his voice unwavering. "I have a witness who was present during the traffic stop and can testify to what they saw." Lane's gaze snapped up, his skepticism giving way to reluctant interest. "A witness, you say?" "Yes, Your Honor," William replied. "An individual who happened to be passing by and recorded part of the encounter on their phone. They're prepared to testify under oath." The courtroom was buzzing now, the energy electric as the pieces of William's strategy began to fall into place. Lane tapped his gavel sharply, silencing the crowd. "We'll hear from this witness. Bring them in." As the witness entered the courtroom, the gallery's anticipation was palpable. Thompson and Brown sat stiffly, their expressions a mix of anger and desperation. They had underestimated William just as everyone in the room had. And now the tide was beginning to turn. William returned to his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He had played his role perfectly, biding his time and waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, as the truth began to unravel before the court, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The witness, a middle-aged man with a straightforward demeanor, took the stand and adjusted the microphone. His name was Robert Taylor, a passerby who had been driving along the same dark Houston road the night of William Hovind's arrest. He shifted slightly in his seat, glancing around the courtroom before meeting Judge Lane's gaze. "Mr. Taylor?" William began calmly, standing and approaching the witness stand. "Can you please tell the court what you saw on the night of my traffic stop?" Robert nodded, his voice steady. "I was driving home that night when I saw a car pulled over by 2 police officers. Something about the way they were handling the situation didn't sit right with me, so I slowed down and started recording on my phone." "What specifically made you feel uneasy?" William asked, his tone encouraging but focused. "Well," Robert replied, choosing his words carefully, "the man they pulled over, who I now know is you, wasn't doing anything threatening. He wasn't raising his voice or acting aggressively, but the officers seemed rough with him. They were yelling at him, grabbing him pretty forcefully. I thought it was excessive." William nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Did you capture any of this on your phone?" "I did," Robert said, holding up his device. "The recording is all here." The courtroom buzzed as the clerk took the phone and prepared the video for display. The gallery, now fully engaged, leaned forward in anticipation. Thompson and Brown sat stiffly, their discomfort evident as the screen lit up and the video began to play. The footage was shaky but clear enough to corroborate William's account. It showed the officers forcibly grabbing him, their voices raised, while William remained composed and compliant. The aggressive tone of the officers stood in stark contrast to William's calm responses. The scene was damning, leaving little room for interpretation. Judge Lane's expression hardened as he watched, his earlier irritation giving way to discomfort. The video added weight to the body camera footage, further undermining the officers' claims of resistance. Thompson and Brown exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now completely eroded. When the video ended, Lane let out a long sigh. "Mr. Taylor," he said, his tone measured. "Thank you for your testimony. You may step down." Robert left the stand, and William returned to his table, his calm composure intact. He had methodically dismantled the narrative constructed by the officers, presenting undeniable evidence of their misconduct. But he wasn't finished yet. "Your Honor," William said, rising once more. "Before I conclude, I would like to address the court directly." Lane raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to proceed. "Go ahead, Mr. Hovind." William walked to the center of the courtroom, his every step measured and deliberate. He paused for a moment, looking out at the gallery, the jury, and finally the judge. "When this trial began," he said, his voice resonating through the room, "it was assumed that I was just another defendant, another man who had allegedly resisted arrest. I chose not to reveal my identity as the United States Attorney General immediately because I wanted this process to unfold as it does for countless others. Those who don't have titles, those who don't have power." The gallery gasped softly, the revelation hitting the room like a thunderclap. Reporters in the back scrambled to take notes, their pens flying across their notebooks. Thompson and Brown stared at William in stunned silence, their faces pale. William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up for all to see. "This is who I am," he said calmly. "And while I wear this badge with pride, I stand here today not just for myself but for every individual who has faced injustice in a system that too often fails them. The evidence speaks for itself. What happened to me was wrong. And what's more troubling is that it happens to others who do not have the means to defend themselves." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the weight of William's words sinking in. Judge Lane's face was unreadable, but his hand tightened slightly on the gavel. The courtroom was electric, the energy buzzing as William returned to his seat, his point made. The truth was now undeniable, and the scales of justice had begun to tip. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens as reporters furiously jotted down notes. The revelation of William Hovind's identity had sent shockwaves through the room, and the tension was almost tangible. Judge Arthur Lane, who had initially treated the case with dismissive authority, now appeared visibly shaken. His gaze shifted from William to the officers, Thompson and Brown, who sat frozen in their seats, their earlier arrogance replaced by pale disbelief. "Mr. Hovind," Lane said slowly, his voice carrying a new tone of respect, "the court recognizes the gravity of your position. Proceed with your evidence." William stood once more, his movements deliberate. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "I would like to present additional evidence that further illustrates the systemic issues at play in this case." He gestured to the clerk, who loaded another file onto the courtroom's monitor. The screen displayed a series of internal police department records, documents that outlined a troubling pattern of behavior. Complaints against officers Thompson and Brown spanned years, detailing incidents of excessive force, racial profiling, and fabricated charges. Many of the complaints had been dismissed or quietly swept under the rug, but the sheer volume of allegations painted a damning picture. "These records," William explained, "were obtained through official channels. They show a consistent pattern of misconduct by officers Thompson and Brown, as well as a troubling lack of accountability within the department." The gallery erupted into murmurs, the gravity of the evidence sinking in. Reporters whispered urgently to one another, their pens flying across their notepads. Outside the courthouse, news of the trial had already begun to spread, and small groups of protesters were gathering, their voices rising in calls for justice. Judge Lane's face darkened as he studied the documents. "Officers," he said sharply, turning his gaze to Thompson and Brown, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Thompson, who had spent the trial radiating smug confidence, now seemed at a loss for words. He stammered, his face reddening, but no coherent defense emerged. Brown looked equally cornered, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Before the officers could respond, William continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "Your Honor, this is not just about what happened to me. This is about a system that allows behavior like this to go unchecked. The evidence is clear. These officers violated their oath to serve and protect. The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy, the weight of William's words rippling through the crowd. Lane tapped his gavel, calling for order, but his expression betrayed a sense of discomfort. He had underestimated William, and now the full scope of the case was laid bare before him. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a second video, captured by a witness in the gallery. This footage, grainy but damning, showed Thompson and Brown laughing and exchanging high fives after placing William in the patrol car. Their casual demeanor contrasted starkly with their claims of being threatened, further undermining their credibility. Lane leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the evidence. The gallery sat in stunned silence, the full extent of the officer's actions now indisputable. William returned to his seat, his calm composure unchanged. He had methodically dismantled the false narrative constructed by the officers, exposing their misconduct and the systemic issues that enabled it. The scales of justice had begun to tip, but the final decision remained in the hands of Judge Lane. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the atmosphere thick as Judge Arthur Lane leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. He stared down at the damning evidence presented by William Hovind: body camera footage, internal police complaints, and the witness testimony that unraveled the officer's fabricated story. What had started as a routine case for Lane had morphed into a seismic revelation of systemic corruption, and the weight of it was written on his face. The gallery watched intently, their whispers now replaced by the collective tension of anticipation. William sat poised and silent at his table, his demeanor steady. He had made his case and trusted in the strength of the evidence, waiting for the wheels of justice to turn. Judge Lane took a deep breath, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. He tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the court to come to order. "I've seen a great many cases in my time," he began, his voice measured. "But it's not often that a case like this comes along. One that exposes not just the actions of a few individuals, but systemic failures that ripple far beyond this courtroom." His words sent a ripple of reaction through the gallery. Thompson and Brown shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their pale faces betraying their fear. The officers, once untouchable, now faced the reality of accountability. "The evidence," Lane continued, his tone firm, "speaks for itself. The actions of Officers Thompson and Brown were not only unprofessional but a blatant abuse of power. This court finds their behavior unacceptable, and it will not go unpunished." The gallery erupted into murmurs, a sense of vindication sweeping through the room. Lane raised his gavel sharply to silence the crowd before turning his attention back to the officers. "Effective immediately, Officers Thompson and Brown are suspended from duty pending further investigation by Internal Affairs. Additionally, I am forwarding this case to federal authorities for review of broader patterns of misconduct within the department." The officers sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Their lawyer leaned over to whisper frantically, but it was clear the tide had turned irreversibly against them. Lane then turned to William, his voice softening. "Mr. Hovind, while this court initially failed to give your case the gravity it deserved, your perseverance and presentation of evidence have ensured that justice has been served. I commend your composure and professionalism in the face of such egregious treatment." The courtroom erupted into applause, the sound echoing against the wooden walls. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as William rose to his feet. He nodded respectfully to Judge Lane before turning to the gallery, acknowledging the support of those who had witnessed the trial. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with protesters holding signs that called for justice and reform. The trial had sparked a fire that spread beyond the courtroom, igniting a movement demanding accountability and change within the Houston Police Department. News of the case reached national outlets, and within hours, William Hovind's name was trending across social media. As he stepped outside into the bright Texas sunlight, William paused, taking a moment to absorb the scene. Protesters cheered as he descended the steps, their chants filling the air with determination and hope. William knew the fight was far from over, but this was a start, a victory that could inspire others to challenge the system. As the dust settled after the dramatic courtroom decision, William Hovind took a moment to reflect. The courtroom may have been a battleground, but the fight for justice was far from over. News outlets had picked up the story of his arrest and trial, broadcasting the footage and evidence to millions. Protests outside the courthouse in Houston had grown, spilling into other cities, igniting conversations about systemic injustice and police misconduct across the nation. Walking through the sea of supporters, William felt a mix of relief and determination. The trial had been a victory, not just for him, but for countless individuals who had faced similar injustices without the privilege or platform to fight back. The system, he realized, was not unbreakable, but change required perseverance, courage, and an unyielding belief in the truth. Later that evening, William sat in his office, his mind racing with thoughts about the larger implications of the trial. He couldn't help but think of the countless others who might not have his resources or the same opportunity to expose the truth. He considered the systemic issues that went beyond Thompson and Brown, issues of accountability, transparency, and the culture within law enforcement that allowed such behavior to persist. The case had brought national attention to the need for reform, but William knew attention alone wasn't enough. Real change required action. As he drafted a plan to push for broader investigations and accountability measures, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This trial was a spark, but it was up to him, and others who shared his vision, to keep the fire burning. His thoughts turned to the people who had supported him, the witnesses who had come forward, the reporters who had broadcast the truth, and the protesters who had turned their outrage into action. It was a collective effort, and it gave him hope that the fight for justice could inspire a movement larger than himself. The next morning, William issued a public statement. Standing before a crowd of reporters and supporters, he spoke with the same calm authority he had demonstrated in the courtroom. "This case is not just about one man or one incident," he said, his voice steady. "It's about holding systems accountable and ensuring that no one, regardless of their background, is above the law or beneath its protection. Change doesn't come easily, but together we can demand it. Justice is not a privilege. It is a right." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices carrying his words far beyond the streets of Houston. William's trial had turned into a pivotal moment, sparking not only a demand for accountability, but also a movement rooted in the belief that justice could, and should, prevail. As he stepped down from the podium, William felt a sense of resolve. The journey was far from over, but the trial had proven that even against overwhelming odds, truth and perseverance could shift the balance. With the echoes of the crowd behind him, he walked forward, ready to continue the fight. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.